Before we begin, if you're enjoying this type of mysterious content, leave your like to support the channel. It really helps us out. Now let's dive into one of the most unsettling mysteries connected to the Titanic, a photograph that has haunted researchers and historians for over a century. What you're about to hear isn't just another maritime tragedy story. This is about a moment captured on film that seems to defy logic, a family's last happy memory that may have captured something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined at the time. The Titanic was more than a ship. It was a symbol of human achievement, confidence, and the belief that technology had finally conquered nature itself. On April 10, 1912, the RMS Titanic departed from Southampton, England, carrying approximately 2,224 passengers and crew members. Among them was the Ashford family, a wealthy American family from Philadelphia who had booked first-class accommodations for what they believed would be the adventure of a lifetime. The Ashford family consisted of William Ashford, a 52-year-old textile magnate whose fortune had been built during the Industrial Revolution. His wife Margaret, 48, a woman known in Philadelphia society for her elegant taste and charitable work. Their son Thomas, 22, a recent Harvard graduate, and their daughter Eleanor, 19, who was considered one of the season's most promising debutantes. They were the embodiment of American success, refined, educated, prosperous, and utterly convinced of their place in the world's elite. On the morning of April 14th, just hours before the Titanic would strike the iceberg that would seal its fate, the Ashford family decided to take advantage of the pristine weather and capture a photograph on the boat deck. This wasn't an unusual request. Throughout the voyage, passengers had been commissioning photographs with their families, wanting to document their presence aboard the most famous ship ever built. It was a status symbol, proof that they had traveled on the Titanic, proof that they mattered. The photograph was taken by a professional photographer named Frederick Beasley, who had been hired by the White Star Line to document life aboard the ship. Beasley was skilled at his craft, known for his ability to capture not just images, but the essence of moments. He positioned the Ashford family near the starboard rail, with the Atlantic Ocean visible behind them, glittering under the afternoon sun. The composition was perfect, the family arranged in a casual yet dignified manner, the ocean providing a magnificent backdrop, the sky clear and promising. William Ashford stood with his arm around Margaret's waist, projecting the confidence of a man who had built an empire. Margaret smiled with the practiced grace of a woman accustomed to being photographed. Thomas stood slightly apart, his youth and education evident in his posture. Eleanor held a parasol, her expression serene, her gaze directed toward the camera with the assurance of someone who had never questioned her place in the world. When Beasley released the shutter, he captured what appeared to be a perfect moment. A family frozen in time, unaware that their ship was racing toward disaster. The photograph was processed and printed the following day, after the Titanic had already sunk. It became one of thousands of photographs taken aboard the ship, and for decades it remained nothing more than a curious historical artifact, filed away in archives and occasionally featured in Titanic exhibitions. If you're enjoying the story so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue bringing you these mysterious narratives. Now, let's continue. The image showed what historians would expect. A well-dressed family, the fashions of 1912, the grandeur of the Titanic visible in the background. But in 1987, when a researcher named Dr. Helen Matthews was examining negatives from the Titanic's voyage, she noticed something extraordinary about the Ashford family photograph. The negative, unlike the prints that had been made from it, revealed details that weren't immediately visible to the naked eye. It was in these shadow areas, in the spaces between light and darkness, that something impossible seemed to exist. On the side of the photograph, just along the ship's hull, where the water reflected the vessel's massive frame, there appeared to be forms in the water. Human forms. At first, Matthews thought it might be debris or an optical illusion created by the way light played across the water's surface. But as she examined the negative more closely, under magnification and with various lighting techniques, the forms became increasingly difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence. The shapes in the water seemed to be figures, multiple figures, and they appeared to be struggling, their arms raised as if reaching for help, their bodies positioned as if they were drowning. But here was the impossibility that would haunt Matthews for the rest of her life. The photograph was taken on the morning of April 14th, hours before the Titanic struck the iceberg, hours before anyone aboard the ship had any reason to believe disaster was imminent, hours before the water would be filled with the desperate dying bodies of over 1,500 people. How could drowning figures appear in a photograph taken when no one was drowning? How could the water reflect tragedy that hadn't yet occurred? Was it a flaw in the photographic process, an accidental double exposure, a trick of light and shadow, or was it something far more disturbing, a glimpse into something that defied rational explanation? Dr. Helen Matthews was not a woman prone to flights of fancy or supernatural speculation. She held a doctorate in photographic history from Cambridge University and had spent 20 years studying maritime photography, particularly images from the early 20th century. Her work was meticulous, peer-reviewed, and grounded firmly in scientific analysis. She was, by temperament and training, a skeptic, which made her discovery all the more troubling. When Matthews first noticed the anomalies in the Ashford family negative, she didn't immediately jump to extraordinary conclusions. Her first instinct, as any responsible researchers would be, was to find a rational explanation. She consulted with photographic experts, conservators, and historians. She examined the negative under various magnifications. She studied the chemical composition of the film stock used in 1912. She investigated whether double exposure, a common accident in early photography, could explain what she was seeing. The negative itself was in remarkable condition, preserved carefully in an archive at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. The emulsion was intact, showing no signs of physical damage or tampering. When Matthews had the negative examined by a photographic conservator named Robert Hutchins, his initial assessment was straightforward. It was a legitimate negative, processed using the technique standard in 1912, and there was no evidence of deliberate alteration or accident. But Hutchins, like Matthews, noticed the figures in the water. "They're there," he told Matthews during one of their consultations, his voice uncertain in a way that suggested discomfort with what his expertise was confirming. "I can't explain how they're there, but they're there." The negative clearly shows human forms in the water, reflected in the ship's side. The detail is too consistent, too anatomically coherent to be random artifact or chemical degradation. Matthews began interviewing descendants of the Ashford family, hoping to find some explanation in their recollections or family records. She discovered that the photograph had been lost to the family for many decades. After the Titanic sank, Margaret Ashford, the sole survivor among the family members, had been so traumatized by the disaster that she reportedly refused to look at photographs from the voyage. The family had stored them away, and they had eventually been donated to maritime museums and archives, where they were catalogued and largely forgotten. Margaret Ashford lived for another 53 years after the sinking, but she rarely spoke about her experience. Those who knew her described her as a woman marked by grief, someone who carried an inexplicable weight that seemed to transcend normal mourning. One of her granddaughters, whom Matthews interviewed, recalled her grandmother saying something cryptic shortly before her death in 1965. "Some photographs capture more than we're meant to see. Some images show us things that haven't happened yet, or things that happened long before the shutter clicked." Was Margaret Ashford simply a traumatized woman speaking in metaphor? Or did she know something about the photograph that she never fully articulated? If this mystery is intriguing you, Drop a comment below about what you think is happening in this photograph. I'd love to hear your theories. Matthews's research led her to examine other photographs from the Titanic's final voyage, looking for similar anomalies. She found nothing comparable in any other image. The Ashford family photograph appeared to be unique, the only surviving image that seemed to contain these inexplicable forms in the water. She also researched the photographer, Frederick Beasley. His career had been unremarkable. He had continued working for the White Star Line for several years after the Titanic disaster, photographing other ships and passengers. He had never mentioned anything unusual about the Ashford family photograph. According to the records available, he had simply done his job, positioned a wealthy family, framed a pleasing composition, and captured the image. He died in 1954, taking any potential first-hand knowledge with him. The mystery deepened when Matthews discovered that several other researchers had noticed similar anomalies in the negative over the decades, but none had published their findings. One researcher, a man named Gerald Fawcett, had apparently become so disturbed by what he found in the photograph that he abandoned his maritime research entirely and spent the last 30 years of his life in relative isolation in the Scottish Highlands. When Matthews attempted to contact him, she learned he had passed away in 1995 without ever publicly discussing his findings. This pattern of researchers noticing something unusual in the photograph and then either remaining silent or abandoning their work became part of the photograph's mystery. What had each of these men and women seen that disturbed them so profoundly? Was it simply the unsettling nature of the anomaly itself? Or was there something more? The negative was eventually transferred to the Titanic Museum in Belfast, where it has been studied by countless researchers, historians, and photographers over the decades. The official position of maritime historians remains cautiously skeptical. The forms in the water are likely explained by photographic artifact, optical illusion, or some aspect of the chemical process used in 1912 that we don't fully understand today. But the negative itself continues to present the same inexplicable imagery, and no satisfactory explanation has ever been offered that fully accounts for what appears in the water beside the Titanic's hull. Over the years, various theories have emerged to explain the Ashford family photograph and the mysterious figures that appear to be drowning in the water. Each theory attempts to rationalize the irrational, to find logic in something that seems to defy it. The first and most conventional theory is photographic artifact. Early photographic processes were imperfect by modern standards, and various chemical interactions, light leaks, or physical damage to the negative could potentially create unexpected imagery. However, photographic experts who have examined the negative find this explanation insufficient. The forms in the water are too detailed, too consistent in their anatomical structure to be random artifact. They appear distinctly human, arms raised, bodies angled, positioning that suggests intentional human figures rather than chemical accident. The second theory involves double exposure or multiple exposures, a known risk in early photography where the same negative could be exposed multiple times, creating layered images. If Beasley had accidentally exposed the negative twice, perhaps once while the ship was in port and again during the Ashford family photograph, it might explain the overlay of figures. However, the records indicate that Beasley was an experienced photographer, and there's no documentation of accidental double exposures in his work. Additionally, the positioning and detail of the figures seem too intentional, too specifically placed in the water beside the ship, to be the result of random, overlapping exposures. A third theory, proposed by some researchers, involves the physics of water reflection and how light interacts with moving water surfaces. Water is not a perfect mirror, it's a dynamic, constantly shifting medium. In certain light conditions, reflections can be distorted, fragmented, or combined in ways that create the illusion of forms that aren't actually present. The afternoon sunlight on the Atlantic, bouncing off the water's rippling surface, could theoretically create visual patterns that the human mind interprets as human figures, a phenomenon known as pareidolia, where our brains recognize familiar patterns, particularly faces and human forms, even in random imagery. But this theory also has limitations. The figures in the negative aren't vague or ambiguous. They possess specific anatomical detail. The arms are distinctly positioned, the torsos show clear human proportions, and the overall composition suggests intentional positioning rather than accidental visual pattern recognition. A fourth, more unusual theory involves temporal anomaly, the idea that the photograph somehow captured images from a time that hadn't yet occurred. This theory ventures into speculative territory, proposing that either the photographic process itself somehow created a temporal overlap, or that the water's reflective properties possessed properties we don't fully understand. Some researchers have suggested that water, being fluid and reflective, might have unique properties related to light and time that we haven't adequately explored. This theory remains highly speculative and isn't accepted by mainstream science, but it has its proponents among researchers fascinated by quantum physics and the nature of time itself. A fifth theory suggests intentional manipulation, that someone deliberately altered the negative or introduced additional imagery through some means. However, no evidence of tampering has ever been discovered, and the negative has been in institutional custody for most of the 20th century, making unauthorized access unlikely. Perhaps most intriguingly, some researchers have proposed that the figures weren't added to the photograph after the fact, but were present at the time of exposure, that there were actually people in the water beside the Titanic on the morning of April 14, 1912. But this raises its own impossible questions. Who would be swimming in the North Atlantic in April? How would people be drowning hours before the ship struck the iceberg? And why would no historical records mention people in the water beside the Titanic on that particular morning? If you're following this mystery with us, make sure to like and subscribe to keep up with these strange historical narratives. The Ashford family photograph has become something of an obsession for a small community of researchers and paranormal enthusiasts. Online forums dedicated to Titanic mysteries regularly feature discussions about the image. Some commenters propose that the photograph captured genuine premonition, that the water somehow reflected deaths that were about to occur. Others suggest that the photograph is evidence of some form of temporal distortion. Still others maintain that it's simply an example of how easy it is for us to see meaning in random imagery when we're primed to expect it. What makes the photograph particularly unsettling is that there's no clear evidence to definitively support any of these theories, nor is there definitive evidence to completely dismiss any of them. The image exists in a state of genuine ambiguity, scientifically interesting but not fully explained, mysterious but not proven to be genuinely anomalous. The Ashford family photograph occupies a unique space in the history of the Titanic. While the disaster itself is thoroughly documented and extensively studied, this single image remains genuinely unexplained. It's a reminder that despite our technological sophistication and our ability to document and analyze the physical world in unprecedented detail, some mysteries persist. Some images refuse to yield their secrets, no matter how thoroughly we examine them. Margaret Ashford was the only member of her family to survive the sinking of the Titanic. She was among the women and children who were loaded into lifeboats while the ship broke apart, and the men, including her husband William, her son Thomas, and her daughter Eleanor, perished in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. Margaret was rescued by the RMS Carpathia and brought to New York, where she faced an overwhelming combination of grief, guilt, and trauma. She had survived while her entire family had died. In the immediate aftermath, she gave several interviews to newspapers, providing accounts of the disaster that were published widely. But as days turned to weeks and weeks turned to months, Margaret became increasingly withdrawn. She abandoned her social life in Philadelphia, her charitable work, and her previous routines. Friends and family members described her as a changed woman, distant, haunted, and often lost in thought. What was particularly striking about Margaret's post-disaster behavior was her reaction to the Titanic's photographic legacy. When photographs from the voyage began to circulate, including the Ashford family image, Margaret reportedly refused to look at them. She instructed her remaining family members not to display them. When, years later, the photographs were donated to museums and archives, Margaret made no effort to retrieve them or influence their handling. It was as if she wanted the visual record of that voyage to simply disappear. In her later years, Margaret gave few interviews, but those who did speak with her reported consistent themes in her statements. She spoke of the voyage as having had a quality of inevitability, that something about the journey, something about the Titanic itself, had felt predetermined and inescapable. She described the final hours before the collision as having an odd, dreamlike quality, as if time itself was somehow distorted. She mentioned, cryptically, that she had experienced moments aboard the ship when she felt as if she were seeing things that hadn't yet happened, fleeting visions or impressions that she couldn't quite articulate or explain. One particularly intriguing account comes from a letter Margaret wrote to her sister in 1920, several years after the disaster. In this letter, which is preserved in a private collection but has been made available to researchers, Margaret made a disturbing statement. "I sometimes wonder if that photograph captured something that William and the children already knew, something that was already written in the water before the ship even left port. I wonder if the water was showing us what was coming, if it was trying to warn us in the only way it could." What did Margaret mean by this cryptic statement? Was she simply a grieving widow, struggling to process inexplicable loss? Or did she possess knowledge about the photograph that she could never fully articulate? Margaret Ashford lived to the age of 96, dying in 1965 in Philadelphia. She never remarried, never had other children, and spent her later years living quietly with her sister's family. Those who knew her in her final years described her as a woman of profound sadness, someone who carried a burden that seemed to exceed normal mourning. She was known to spend long hours alone, and her conversations often drifted toward philosophical questions about fate, destiny, and whether human beings had any real agency in the events of their lives. She left behind no journals, no detailed accounts of her experience, no written explanations for her cryptic statements about the photograph. Whatever she knew, whatever she understood about that image, she took with her when she died. The second survivor connected to the photograph was Frederick Beasley, the photographer who had taken the image. Unlike Margaret, Beasley continued his life relatively normally after the disaster. He continued working for the White Star Line, photographing passengers and ships for several more years. But colleagues and acquaintances noted a change in him. He became less communicative, more withdrawn. His photography, while still technically skilled, seemed to lose the vitality and creativity that had characterized his earlier work. In 1920, Beasley left his position with White Star Line and moved to Scotland, where he opened a small portrait studio in Edinburgh. He lived quietly there for the remainder of his life, rarely speaking about his work aboard the Titanic or his experiences during the disaster. When researchers attempted to interview him in the 1950s, shortly before his death, he refused to discuss the Ashford family photograph specifically, though he would speak generally about his photography work. One researcher, who managed to speak with Beasley briefly before his death, reported that when the Ashford photograph was mentioned, Beasley became visibly uncomfortable and changed the subject. When pressed, he allegedly said only, "Some things are better left unexamined. Some images are meant to be forgotten." These testimonies, from Margaret Ashford and from Frederick Beasley suggest that those closest to the photograph, those who understood its context and its creation most intimately, believed there was something genuinely disturbing about it. Whether this disturbance was rooted in the photograph's actual content or in their own traumatic memories and psychological responses remains unclear. What's certain is that neither Margaret nor Beasley ever provided a definitive explanation for what appears in the water beside the Titanic's hull. Their silence, whether chosen or compelled, has only deepened the mystery. Today, more than a century after the Titanic sank, the Ashford family photograph remains one of the most enigmatic images connected to the disaster. It's preserved in climate-controlled conditions, examined periodically by researchers and historians, and discussed extensively in online communities devoted to maritime mysteries and the paranormal. Yet it remains fundamentally unexplained. The photograph exists in a liminal space between rational explanation and genuine mystery. It's not supernatural in the traditional sense. There's no claim that ghosts created the imagery or that mystical forces were at work. But it is genuinely anomalous, genuinely difficult to explain through conventional photographic science and physics. And perhaps that's what makes it so compelling and so disturbing to those who encounter it. Throughout history, photography has been associated with truth and documentation. A photograph, we're taught, captures what actually existed in front of the camera at the moment of exposure. Photographs are evidence. They're proof. In the 19th and 20th centuries, photography was considered the most objective way to document reality. The camera doesn't lie, people said, treating photographs as unimpeachable records of what actually occurred. But the Ashford family photograph suggests something more complex. It suggests that photographs might capture things we don't fully understand, things that might exist beyond our conventional frameworks of space and time. It raises questions about the nature of documentation itself, about whether a photograph can contain information or meaning that extends beyond the simple physical capture of light and shadow. Consider what we know. A family posed for a photograph hours before their ship sank. The photograph appears to show drowning figures in the water. Those figures couldn't have been physically present at the time the photograph was taken. No one had entered the water yet. Yet the figures are undeniably present in the negative, rendered in sufficient detail that they can't be dismissed as random artifact or optical illusion. How do we reconcile these facts? What explanation encompasses all of them simultaneously? One possibility is that we simply accept the mystery as irreducible. Perhaps there are phenomena that exist beyond our current capacity to understand or explain. Perhaps photography, with its interaction of light, chemistry, and the material properties of water, might create effects that we don't yet fully comprehend. Perhaps the universe contains more complexity, more ambiguity than our scientific frameworks currently accommodate. This acceptance of mystery has become increasingly unfashionable in our modern world. We live in an era of rapid scientific advancement, of technology that would have seemed miraculous to previous generations. We're accustomed to explanations, to solutions, to the idea that every mystery can eventually be solved through sufficient research and analysis. The idea that something might remain genuinely unexplained is uncomfortable to us. And yet, mysteries persist. Despite our technology, despite our knowledge, despite our sophisticated tools for analysis and investigation, some phenomena refuse to yield their secrets. The Ashford family photograph is just one example. An image that sits in a museum archive, accessible to anyone who wishes to examine it, and yet remaining fundamentally mysterious. What happened to Margaret Ashford in those final years of her life? What burden did she carry? What understanding did she possess about that photograph that she never fully articulated? We'll never know. What did Frederick Beasley believe he had captured when he released the shutter that afternoon in April 1912? His secrets died with him. The photograph itself offers no answers. only questions. It offers an invitation to mystery, an acknowledgement that the world might contain phenomena that resist easy categorization or explanation. If you've enjoyed exploring this mystery with us, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think those figures in the water represent? Do you believe there's a rational explanation, or does this image suggest something beyond our current understanding? Drop your theories and your thoughts. I genuinely love reading your perspectives and engaging with your interpretations. The Ashford family photograph will likely remain mysterious. Future researchers may develop new tools, new technologies that could reveal additional information or provide alternative explanations. Or the photograph may continue to resist definitive interpretation, remaining a beautiful and terrible reminder of our capacity to capture images that we cannot fully comprehend. It's a photograph that asks us to contemplate the limits of knowledge, the boundaries of understanding. It's an image that refuses to be neatly categorized, that persists in its ambiguity and its strangeness. And perhaps that's the real mystery. Not the figures in the water, but our need to explain them, our discomfort with phenomena that don't fit neatly into our frameworks of understanding. Before you leave, if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next mysterious stories. We're constantly exploring historical enigmas, photographs that defy explanation, and mysteries that continue to haunt researchers and historians. Your support helps us continue this work, and your engagement, your likes, your comments, your subscriptions means everything to us. Thank you for spending this time exploring the mystery of the Ashford family photograph with us. Until next time, keep questioning, keep wondering, and keep your eyes open for the mysteries that surround us.